You ever notice how small a pill really is? Just a tiny white circle, barely the size of your fingernail. Looks harmless, maybe even helpful. Something a doctor gives you, something meant to ease the pain. But what if I told you that one of those pills was the beginning of the deadliest drug epidemic in modern American history? It started with a promise to relieve pain, to help people live better, fuller lives. But that promise came with a catch, one that cost over 500,000 lives. This isn't a story about illegal drugs in dark alleys. This is about legal prescriptions, about doctors, about trust, and about a company that sold hope in a bottle and knew it wasn't the truth. So how did it happen? Who's responsible when the pain doesn't come from the illness, but from the cure? To understand this modern plague, we need to go back, not too far, just to the late 1990s. In the 1990s, something strange was happening in American healthcare. Doctors were overwhelmed, patients were exhausted, and pain, the invisible symptom, had become the fifth vital sign. Hospitals were being graded on how well they treated it. Patient satisfaction was tied to pain relief. Suddenly, everyone wanted better pain management, and fast. At the same time, the healthcare system itself was already under pressure. Insurance companies were cutting corners. Hospitals were looking for efficiency. And doctors, juggling more patients than ever, often turned to the simplest solution, the prescription pad. Enter OxyContin. In 1996, Purdue Pharma launched what they called a revolution in pain relief, a powerful opioid that, according to them, could last 12 hours and had a very low risk of addiction. They said it was different, safer, smart. Doctors were intrigued, patients were hopeful. Sales reps from Purdue flooded clinics with brochures, free samples, and educational sessions. Everything pointed to one thing: this pill was the future. And honestly, people wanted to believe that. Chronic pain is cruel. Watching someone you love suffer is worse. So when a company promised a miracle, a way out, people believed them. Even the FDA approved the drug with surprisingly little resistance. There were no long-term studies, no independent trials on addiction risk, just Purdue's word, and the word of doctors they trained and sponsored. That's how the stage was set, a nation eager for relief, a system ready to medicate, and a company that saw a chance, not just to help, but to profit. But behind that miracle pill was a marketing machine far more powerful than any medicine. Let's be clear about one thing. Purdue Pharma didn't just create a drug. They created a narrative, and they sold it with surgical precision. The drug was called OxyContin, a slow-release opioid painkiller marketed as a miracle. But what made it dangerous wasn't just what was inside the pill, it was what surrounded it. The lies, the manipulation, the machinery of influence. And it started with the Sacklers. The Sackler family owned Purdue Pharma. To the public, they were philanthropists, museum donors, education patrons, the type of billionaires who shook hands in tuxedos. But inside boardrooms, they were something else entirely. Strategists, marketeers, empire builders. The goal was simple: sell OxyContin, and sell it hard. But opioids weren't new. What was new, and groundbreaking in the worst way, was the way Purdue positioned it. They claimed OxyContin was safe, even for long-term use. They told doctors it was virtually non-addictive, citing a one-paragraph letter from 1980, not even a peer-reviewed study, less than 1% addiction rate. That figure would haunt America for decades. To push this message, Purdue launched one of the most aggressive pharmaceutical marketing campaigns in U.S. history. They hired hundreds of sales reps, trained them to be friendly, persuasive, persistent. These reps were taught to educate doctors, not just about OxyContin's benefits, but to downplay its risks. They gave out brochures, free samples, branded pens, sponsored pain management conferences. Doctors were taken to dinner, flown to resorts. Some were even paid speakers, repeating Purdue's talking points to their peers under the guise of continuing medical education. And it worked. By 2000, OxyContin sales topped $1 billion. Doctors were prescribing it not just for cancer or surgery, but for toothaches, back pain, migraines, even minor sprains. Purdue encouraged this. The more prescriptions, the better. There were even internal documents showing how sales reps were incentivized to push higher doses, because the stronger the pill, the higher the profit. Meanwhile, thousands of patients were quietly becoming addicted. The drug didn't always last the promised 12 hours. When it wore off early, users began to experience withdrawal symptoms, anxiety, muscle pain, nausea. And the solution? Purdue told doctors to increase the dose, not to question the drug's design. That one instruction, increase the dose, destroyed lives. Some patients started taking pills more often than prescribed. Others crushed them to snort or inject, seeking the high more quickly. OxyContin by design was abusable, and Purdue knew it. By the early 2000s, reports were surfacing across the country of pill mills, clinics that handed out prescriptions like candy. Small towns in places like West Virginia, Kentucky, and Ohio were flooded with OxyContin. In some counties, there were more prescriptions than people. Purdue's internal memos from the time are chilling. They called high-prescribing doctors whales, a casino term for big spenders. They tracked pharmacies and clinics, mapping out where they could grow sales fastest. And even as news reports of overdoses mounted, they doubled down, telling reps to stay confident and to continue emphasizing the 12-hour relief claim. In 2001, Purdue made nearly $3 billion from OxyContin alone. But by then, the cracks were showing. Communities were overwhelmed. Hospitals saw a spike in overdoses. Families were holding funerals for 16-year-olds who never made it to senior year. Local newspapers ran obituaries with phrases like "died unexpectedly" or "after a long illness," code for addiction-related death. Even law enforcement couldn't keep up. Some sheriffs reported that entire jail populations were now opioid-related. Pharmacies were being robbed. People were driving for hours just to find someone, anyone, willing to sell them pills. In 2007, Purdue Pharma faced its first major legal reckoning. The company pled guilty to criminal misbranding and paid $600 million in fines, one of the largest pharmaceutical settlements at the time. 3 executives, including the company's president, took guilty pleas. But here's the thing. The company kept selling OxyContin. They didn't reform. They didn't stop. In fact, they pivoted, developing abuse-deterrent formulas, lobbying for more protection of their patents, and quietly investing in treatments for opioid addiction. Yes, they were preparing to profit from the very crisis they caused. By 2010, the crisis had entered a new phase. As prescription opioids became harder to get, many users turned to heroin. It was cheaper, more accessible, and often more potent. Later, fentanyl, a synthetic opioid up to 100 times stronger than morphine, began flooding the streets. Overdose deaths skyrocketed. Between 1999 and 2019, 500,000 Americans died from opioid overdoses. Many were working class. Many lived in rural areas. Many had never touched an illegal drug before their first prescription. And all this time, the Sackler family continued to profit. In private emails revealed later in lawsuits, Sackler executives discussed pushing OxyContin harder in regions with high abuse potential, meaning places where people were more likely to get addicted. They weren't just aware, they were targeting vulnerability. In 2019, faced with thousands of lawsuits from states, cities, and individuals, Purdue Pharma filed for bankruptcy. The Sacklers agreed to a settlement worth over $4 billion, but they admitted no wrongdoing. They were granted immunity from future civil lawsuits. They kept their billions. They walked away, and in their wake, they left a country drowning in grief, rage, and pills. But what happens after the headlines fade? What does a nation look like when it's been hollowed out by addiction? Not by a cartel, but by a company. Let's talk about what was lost and what we've yet to learn. The numbers are overwhelming. Over 500,000 lives lost to opioid overdoses in the US since 1999. But numbers don't grieve. Numbers don't explain what it means when an entire generation of parents lose their children, or when grandparents are forced to raise their grandchildren because their own kids are gone, or when newborn babies enter the world already in withdrawal. This crisis didn't just happen in big cities. It gutted rural towns, working-class neighborhoods, and places already struggling with poverty, injury, and unemployment. In some communities, it's hard to find a single family untouched. Hospitals were overwhelmed, foster care systems collapsed, local economies crumbled under the weight of lost workers and rising healthcare costs, and trust in doctors, in medicine, in the system itself was shattered. But what's even more haunting is that this wasn't a random disaster. It was built, systematically, slowly, legally. So what did we learn? For one, we learned that when medicine becomes a business, a big one, people get hurt, especially when profit is prioritized over ethics, when drug companies are allowed to market like soda brands, when regulation is weak, when education is just disguised advertising. We also learned how hard it is to pull the brakes once the train is moving. Once doctors believed OxyContin was safe, once patients needed it to function, once the addiction had begun, there was no easy way to stop. And here's the thing, even now the story isn't over. New opioids still exist, marketing hasn't disappeared, and the next crisis could already be growing. Maybe not in a pill bottle, but somewhere else we trust too easily. So maybe the lesson isn't just about one drug, one company, or one mistake. It's about remembering that trust is powerful, and when it's exploited, the damage isn't just personal, it's generational. And in the end, when the lawsuits are settled and the headlines fade, we're left with one quiet question. What do we do with the grief and the truth that remain? In the end, the opioid crisis wasn't just about pills or profit. It was about pain, real pain, and what happens when our trust is turned into currency. The people who died didn't ask for addiction, they asked for help, relief, a better life. And in return, they were sold a lie, wrapped in a prescription bottle. We may never see the Sacklers in handcuffs, we may never undo the damage, but we can remember, we can question, and we can choose not to forget. Because dark history doesn't just live in the past, it lingers, it repeats when we stop paying attention. If this story moved you or made you think, share it. Someone you know may still be living through a version of it. Thanks for listening to Dark History. Until next time, stay curious, stay awake, and don't let silence rewrite the past.